Alrighty, so let's move into the second portion here. So the very first lesson of part two that we hit was about the election of 1896 and how William McKinley easily defeated William Jennings Bryan in that election. And we had talked about how in his inaugural address, William McKinley had brought up this very specific situation that the United States was not interested in entering war to expand itself or to gain territory, but that we would defend ourselves if we were provoked. And I mentioned, and we talked about in class, that he specifically brought this up because of the circumstances that America was inching closer to war, and that he felt that war was coming down the horizon, but he sort of wanted to set the conditions for how that war would occur. And the war that we're talking about is the war with Spain. So America's issues with Spain are really tied into Cuba, one of Spain's remaining colonies in the Caribbean and one of the last remaining European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Now, shortly after the end of the Civil War in 1869, there was a revolt in Cuba. The Cubans, who were essentially slaves, revolted against the Spanish. Now, we had just finished fighting a civil war that, we made about slavery, and we ended slavery in America because of that war. And we were a country that was born out of revolution against oppression. So it was natural that Americans would have sympathies towards this. Now, officially, the position of the government is that the U.S. was neutral. We would not be involved or anything else with the war. This was, in our view, this was a Spanish incident or a Spanish matter, and we had nothing to do with it. Privately, however, Americans really did support the Cubans. And the Spanish did put down the revolt, but not unlike the cicadas who, randomly appear every few years. Every few years, Cuba decided to have another revolt. So 6 years down the road, in 1875, there is yet another Cuban revolt. And in 1875, we have the rather odd case of what is called the Virginius incident, or the Virginius affair. The Virginius was a privately owned American ship. It wasn't even wasn't a government ship. It really wasn't even technically a commercial ship in some senses. It was in the Caribbean, near Cuba. The Spanish Navy pulled the ship over off the coast of America. Now remember, Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States, okay? We are closer to Cuba as a country than Milwaukee is close to Chicago. That's how close Cuba is. In any case, the Virginius was pulled over by the Spanish Navy. It was boarded by the Navy without permission. They went through the ship, and on board the vessel, they discovered supplies, food, medical supplies, probably guns and ammunition. And the Spanish Navy accused the Americans who owned the ship of being pirates, and they killed all of them on the spot. Now, killing civilians of another country by a government is officially an act of war. The president at the time, Ulysses S. Grant, the same president, by the way, who was in office when the Cuban slave revolt broke out 6 years earlier, Ulysses S. Grant, rather than declare war, negotiated a settlement where the Spanish government paid several $100,000 to the families of the people who were executed. Now, the reason for this was that in 1875, Grant realized that America's Navy was in no condition to take on the Spanish, and that we would get our butts kicked if we went to war with Spain over something like this. Now, there's also the problem of why it is that America has so much concern about Cuba. It's not just humanitarian. We have a large amount of money invested in Cuba because Cuba is a source of sugar for us, not unlike Hawaii. And if you remember what happened to Hawaii, I think you're going to get a sneak peek here a little bit. The U.S. had begun to buy up areas of Cuba to run as sugar plantations. In fact, Cuba was actually sending more sugar to America than they were sending back to Spain. And American farmers and businessmen began suggesting, if you know what I'm saying, that the Cubans could make a lot more money if the Spanish weren't around. And the Spanish kind of realized what was being implied here, like as in get rid of the Spanish by, overthrowing them. And Spain became more and more distrustful of America. This is a political cartoon from a Spanish newspaper. The care and concern of Uncle Sam, guarding the island. Well, notice the leering, terrifying, trollish Uncle Sam reaching down to grab Cuba. It's not because he's guarding the island, it's because he has ulterior business motives in mind for Cuba. Now, the prospect of having to deal with an eventual conflict over the question of Cuba is something that was a driving factor in the modernization of the Navy. But at the same time that we're talking about here, there's a book published. And that book was written by a naval officer named Alfred T. Mahan. And it's a book that does a historical analysis of the relationship between prosperity and naval power in history. And Mahan goes through and using the science and, all the factoids and stuff, basically sets up and establishes that throughout history, all the great nations and empires who have succeeded have all had a really first-class navy. And his conclusion is that if the United States wants to be a big country, a big boy country, we need a first-class navy. So when we look at the modernization of the Navy that we've been talking about, it's Mahan's book, the Virginius Incident, and Krupp's Big Guns that all influenced the War Department to modernize the Navy. And that took place over the space of 5 different presidencies. So tomorrow, we're going to pick up and look a little bit more at this. As I said, for today, peace and love.